Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we are in round 7 of our coverage, the 2017 U.S. Chess Championships. Our competitors today, whites played by Yaroslav Zherebukh, Ukrainian-born American Grandmaster, currently lives in St. Louis, Missouri, so just down the street from where the tournament's at. He's 23 years old, has a rating of 26.57. His opponent, Fabiano Caruana, playing the black piece, is 24 years old, also lives in St. Louis, Missouri, so they're somewhat neighbors. With a current rating of 28.66, third highest rated player in the world, does have a 200 point difference in rating from Fabiano and Yaroslav. Both of these players are tied for second, only a half a point coming into this round behind Wesley So. And before this game ended, Wesley So tied his game. So if one of these players can get a victory, they will be tied for the lead. We'll go ahead and get started with Yaroslav starting with pawn to e4, pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, and then bishop to b5. So getting into the Ruy Lopez, pawn to a6, bishop back here to a4, a knight to f6. We've been seeing a lot of this. Castle on the king side, bishop e7. And we see a very interesting variation of the Ruy Lopez. Haven't seen it all too often. It has crept up every now and then. And that is the Breyer variation. If you're not super familiar with it, after the bishop comes back here to b3, pawn d6, just solidifying pawn c3, getting ready to push forward with pawn to d4. Castle on the king side, pawn h3, and then knight to b8. And this is kind of that, I would say, critical move in the opening where it gets its name is this wasn't played for a long time, and then all of a sudden someone kind of noticed that, hey, if I could play knight here to b8, then I could push forward with pawn to c5, start to really push on the queen side of the board. Then I can swing my knight over here to d7, try to protect the square here on e5, so this gives me a lot of options. And right now, since it is the closed Ruy Lopez, we didn't see any exchange or anything going on, then really just maneuvering your knights to where you want to go is usually a good strategy. So although we don't see it very often, it is always entertaining to see how these players approach it, if they go with the main line or if they come up with something super creative that we haven't seen before. From here, white can kind of choose between pawn to d3, which is a little quieter, or pawn to d4, which is the main line. Continues with a pawn to d4, knight to d7 as we talked about, knight to d2, getting this involved. It can't come to c3 because of the pawn. Bishop to b7, both sides just getting their material developed a little bit better. Bishop down here, c2, adding a little pressure on the square here on e4. You can see both sides really just getting all their minor pieces to protect the center of the board. Rook to e8, knight back here to f1. Does want to position it here to g3. If you could come up here to f5, a nice little outpost. Also wants to open up for this rook on e1 to protect this pawn. And then bishop to f8. Same sort of concept. You do want your rook here on e8 to protect the pawn, but does have to be aware that the dark square bishop, it's not doing too much right now. Maybe he could fianchetto with pawn to g6, get his bishop here to g7, or maybe outside the pawn chain with bishop to h6. So he has some options. You need to always keep in mind that when you play with your bishop back here on f8, you need to eventually get it back in the game, or it's just kind of a wasted piece on the board. Knight to g3, and then pawn to g6, stopping the knight come over here to f5. I'm not sure that I necessarily like the pawn to g6. Totally understand why you would do it. I think there's an option to try another theory, knight to b6. You know, if he does play a knight to b5, you can always kick it back if you want to. That's fine. But starting to put a little pressure on the queen side of the board, I think this makes a lot of sense. But the main line is just to play pawn to g6. Both of these players are spending about 10 seconds per move. So they're just going down the main line. Doesn't seem like a lot of preparation went into any crazy variations that are outside the main line. And so we continue with just the main line. Pawn to a4, and then pawn to c5, looking to blow up the center of the board. And then pawn up to d5. Now, if we come back a little bit earlier and say, you know, when the knight came down here to, f1, if white were to try to play pawn to d5 at this point, now it gets a little tricky. It's just pawn to c6, then we see exchange on board. This is not nearly as good. White has lost a central pawn here. The light square bishop is putting a lot of pressure on white, so he doesn't necessarily like this. But if we kind of move things around, and now all of a sudden black pushes forward with pawns to c5, now it makes total sense for the pawn to come here to d5. This is definitely a closed position. No one's trying to open up this game at all. And usually in a closed position, knights are going to reign supreme. So you'll see a lot of maneuvering with the knights to get into the best positions, find little outpost moves, and then start to attack some of these pawns, like the backward pawns here on d6. So keep that in mind as we're kind of going through. Pawn down here, c4, just solidifying the pawn chain, making it a little more difficult for some of the squares to move around, or the pieces to move around. Bishop to b3 doesn't make sense anymore, or d3 as well. Now the bishop to g5, and there were a couple options. Didn't have to play bishop to g5. Could have instead decided to play, his rook get involved into the game. That makes sense. Maybe get his queen involved, but decided to go ahead and get his bishop here to g5, and then pawn to h6. And this is one of those where this is the main line, pawn to h6, forcing the bishop to move. But I like a little bit different line. I like queen to c7, starting to put more pressure on the queen side of the board. This knight is no longer pinned down to the queen, so it doesn't have to worry about that anymore. If the bishop takes the knight, that's fine. You could just recapture with the knight right here. The problem I have with the main line is after pawn to h6, we see the bishop come back here, knight down to c5, queen up here to d2. There is both the queen and the bishop attacking the pawn, and so the pawn's almost forced to come here to h5, and all of a sudden black has completely weakened his king side of the board. He can defend this with proper play throughout the rest of the game, but white really didn't have to give up too much. Black doesn't have a strong advance on the queen side of the board because he was really just playing around with his pawns over here on the h-file. So all in all, I'm not sure I necessarily like the main line, but don't know all the preparation that went into it for Fabiano Caruana. He seems familiar enough. He didn't spend tons of time playing these moves, but he does have a weakened king side getting into the middle game. Now that the pawn is no longer on h6, then white plays bishop to g5, just coming back to exactly where we were, which is kind of why I don't necessarily like bringing the pawn to h6, but that's fine. Bishop to g7, another play that he could have played instead of that queen to c7. Could have just played bishop here to g7. Rook to f1, queen down here to c7. Now he plays it, and this is the first variation in the main line. And a lot of players will always reach out and say, how are the grandmasters? What really separates them? One of the big things is their minds are computers, and they memorize all these crazy variations. They didn't spend much time at all. There was both players. There was maybe one move where they spent over a minute. But other than that, all their moves were just automatic because they were pretty much all memorized. They spent maybe 10 seconds on most of the moves. So getting into 21 moves, getting into the middle game, there's no mistakes because this is all theory. They all know all the lines, and there's not really any complications. They're just kind of waiting for their opponent to play something that's novel. Queen to c7 is the first novel move. So we continue bishop to h6. We do see bishop coming back here to h8, and this is now that we're out of theory. Fabiano Caruana actually took about 30 minutes to play this bishop to h8. He was trying to figure out, how some other options would go. He would really like to play something like pawn to a4. I think part of his 30-minute calculation is going through the lines of the bishop takes, the king takes, and now knight up to f5. And it gets kind of tricky. You have one option with just the pawn taking. This is the most obvious. Queen to g5. The king comes to h7. We see queen take, check, forcing the king move back, and then all of a sudden the knight is going to fall here on f6. King side completely destroyed, gotten back the material on board, so that's not going to be good. If we come back and say, let's say the pawn does not take, instead the king is going to move king to g8, no other square is really good. You start getting into king to h8 or h7, any of these, and you can get a check. Well, that's definitely going to be worse because you're just going to checkmate after queen to g7. But let's say king to g8. Now the queen comes up here. essentially forced to take the knight, and then we're going to have the same song and dance as we did before. The knight is going to fall really bad position. So Fabiano, after a lot of deliberation, decides to go ahead and play bishop back here to h8. He could have just taken the bishop, and there's merit to that, getting some of the pressure off the board. I think Yaroslav does have a pretty strong attack going on the king side of the board, so I usually favor just exchanging material off, but decides to go and play bishop back here to h8. And then knight to g5, and then knight to h7. You can see black playing really, really defensive here. Having your bishop back here on h8 and knight to h7 is not really how you draw it up too often. But we do see an exchange. Kind of crazy that we're 24 moves and we see our first piece or pawn coming off the board. We usually see it much, much sooner than that. But after that, we see bishop come back here to e3, queen to e7, just centralizing, and then pawn pushing forward to f4. Had a little quieter moves, but decided to go ahead and start to blow up. Since he has a strong attack on the king side of the board, he wants to go ahead and activate his rook here on f1. Once this file opens up, semi-open file, he can take with his rook if he wants to. He can swing his other rook over here to f1. So he does have some options, but wants to be as aggressive as possible against his opponent that he knows right now is playing very, very defensive. Fabiano takes on f4, and then the bishop recaptures. Could have also taken with his rook on f4, and then swung his other rook over here to f1. But decides to go and take it with his bishop. King to g8, now rook to f3, getting ready to double barrel with his other rook on f1. Bishop g7, rook to f1 as we talked about, and then knight to d7. I really think, because the next move from white's going to be bishop to h6, so that he can get his queen over here. Very aggressive square for the queen. That's going to activate the double rooks as we've looked at on the square here on f7. I think he really wants to be playing rook to f8 to control this square. Otherwise, his rook's not doing a ton. Attacking this backward square right here on e4 is not the tactic he needs to be looking at, because he's eventually going to play knight down here to e5. That's going to be blocking the rook anyway. So I think knight to d7, not necessarily the move that he wants to be playing, but that's what we did. Bishop to h6, we do see the exchange on board, and then queen to f8. And this is important as far as the rook to f8 is now a mistake. It's just that ship is sailed, because then knight to h5, pawn can't recapture. It is going to be checkmate. Rook to g3, only way to stop it, queen down to g5, and then rook up here, that's going to be checkmate. So he had his opportunity to play rook to f8. It is no longer there. Now queen to f8. Can't just take this pawn, because then the queen's going to fall. That's definitely going to be the bad way to go. But decides to bring his queen back here to d2. He has a strong attack, does not want to exchange his queens off the board. Knight down to e5, and then rook to f6. So, putting so much pressure on his opponents. This light square bishop hasn't been doing too much. After that move of pawn to d5, that kind of locked this side of the board, and so he, as long as he keeps his pieces over here on the dark squares, this light square bishop's not going to be doing too much on the game. He can also later on activate his own light square bishop. He could play bishop to d1, start to attack, maybe even if he wanted to sacrifice, go with some crazy ending where he gets all of his rooks on the king side of the board, sacrifices bishop. He does have that option as well. Rook to d8, queen up here to g5, continuing his aggression. Queen to g7, bishop down d1, as we talked about. Bishop c8, and then queen down here to h4. King f8, and just maneuvering a little bit, seeing where his opponent is going to go. Black is completely on defensive, can't really do too much. All of his pieces just sitting back, not many squares to go to, and some side could start to attack on the queen side of the board, but once you start using up some of your moves on the queen side of the board, all of a sudden your opponent can overwhelm you on the king side. So king to g8, king to h1. Not really sure that the king is under a ton of pressure here for white. I don't think he had to play king to h1. Maybe now's the opportunity to just go ahead and take on b5, and then let's say pawn recaptures, and then knight to e2, queen g7, but now you can play knight to d4. This is getting the knight Great square, could attack this square on b5, could come up here, nice little outpost on c6, start to really limit the squares that the rooks can control. He can also play knight to e6. That kind of holds the this bishop on c8 hostage, because the pawn can't take because it's being pinned down by the rook. So I think that was the move that maybe he wanted to play. King to h8, maybe just a little bit too paranoid about an attack from black, but Fabiano is not doing any attacking right now. Rook to e7. Now the bishop takes on h5, and then the pawn recaptures. And we look at it and say, why did he not take with his own pawn? He really can't take, because then knight to h5 and things start to get pretty bad. If the bishop were to take and then queen to g7, okay, well now the pawn just takes, pawn recaptures, and then the bishop just comes back here to d1. Got that pawn for free. So all in all, no way to really stop it. Decides to go and just take over on the queen side of the board. Yaroslav continues with bishop to d1, attacking the pawn right here. And then queen to g7, bishop up here takes on a4, queen to a7. You can kind of see that this queen just doesn't have too many great squares to go to. He's kind of locked in. He's somewhat playing defensive, waiting to see where Yaroslav's going to play. Queen to g5, pawn to a5. Pawn to a5 is not doing much of anything. Just doesn't have many great options. King to g1. I don't think he needs to be this defensive again with his king, but maybe he doesn't want to have to worry about something. A bishop to b5, and then we see some crazy exchange on board, and then there's some combination where he has a perpetual check and it's a draw. I don't think Fabiano could actually pull that off, but white just doesn't want to have to deal with that right now. So he plays king here to g1, queen back here to h8, rook here to f4, getting ready to activate it, bring it over here to h4. That could be very deadly. Queen to g7, rook to h4, knight down here to d3. It's a nice outpost, but that's not really what the game's about right now. But that's fine. Not many great options. Rook here to h6, attacking. Now knight comes back. e5, much better outpost move. Rook to f4. Bishop to d7. Could exchange if he wants to, but decides to go ahead and play the queen back here to h4. Getting ready to push to h8 if he wants to. Does just open up a ton of opportunities for him. King to g8. That's kind of a forced move. He would have lost his queen if he didn't. But the problem with that is now his rook is going to fall. Queen takes on e7. Rook to e8. The material advantage just going in the wrong direction. The bishop does eventually take on a4. But then after rook to f6, then Fabiano decides that now's the time to go ahead and resign. There's just too many threats on board. The knight can start to get involved, but he has too many major pieces on the king side of the board. So he recognizes his fate, decides to go ahead and resign. So, Yaroslav, congratulations to him. He was completely outmatched from a rating perspective, but he was already tied for second in the tournament, playing extremely well. And now he's tied with Wesley So for first place. So congratulations to him. Played extremely well against a variation that we don't see all that often in the Ruy Lopez, but he seemed prepared for it, knew the main line, and then took it down a place where he had a great attack and executed better than Fabiano did. So congratulations. Thank you guys for watching round 7. It's been one of the best tournaments we've covered in a while. Lots of action. Players really going for the win each and every game. So hopefully you guys are enjoying it, and we will see you tomorrow for round 8.